The great hall of Valanthra Prime stretched for nearly a mile in every direction, its crystal walls catching the light of 3 distant suns and scattering rainbows across the gathered delegates from 40 different worlds. Princess Zilara of the Kethrani Empire stood near the center of the hall, her 4 arms folded across her chest as she watched the lesser species mingle and talk and pretend they were her equals. Her scales shimmered with colors that shifted between deep purple and bright gold, announcing to everyone who understood Kethrani biology that she was both royalty and warrior, both beautiful and deadly. She had earned those colors through blood and combat, defeating 17 champions from 11 different worlds in ritual duels that had expanded her empire across the stars. The Kethrani did not believe in costly wars that destroyed planets and killed millions. They believed in the old way, the pure way, where leaders faced each other blade to blade. Blade and the strongest took what they deserved. Zilara had never lost such a duel, not once in her 200 years of life. Her trophy room back home contained the broken weapons of every champion who had dared to face her, and she planned to add many more before her reign ended. Today she watched the delegates with the bored expression of a predator surrounded by prey animals who did not know they were food. The Valanthrans were ancient and wise, but physically weak. The Morvacs were strong, but slow and stupid. The Crystalline Collective did not even have individual bodies worth fighting. None of them interested her. None of them offered any challenge worth her attention. Then the human delegation arrived, and Zilara felt her scales flicker with mild curiosity. Humans were new to the galactic community, having discovered faster-than-light travel only 60 years ago. They were considered primitive by most standards, a young species, still learning how to behave among their betters. Their bodies were soft and fragile, with only 2 arms, and dull skin that did not change color to show emotion. They lived for less than a century, barely enough time to learn anything useful before death claimed them. The galactic consensus was that humans would either be conquered or absorbed within a few generations, their brief moment among the stars ending before it truly began. Zilara watched as the human group entered the hall. There were 6 of them, led by a tall woman with dark hair who carried herself with the confidence of someone used to giving orders. Ambassador Catherine Powell, if Zilara remembered correctly from the briefing documents. Behind her walked various aides and advisors, all of them looking around the great hall with expressions of wonder that confirmed their primitive nature. But one human caught Zilara's attention. He was older than the others, perhaps 50 of their short years, with gray appearing at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of experience rather than age. He did not look around in wonder like his companions. He looked around like someone who was assessing threats and exits, like someone who had walked into dangerous rooms before and wanted to know all his options. His name was Daniel Carter, and his official title was Cultural Attaché, which meant nothing to Zilara. What interested her was the way he moved. Despite a slight limp in his left leg, he walked with a balance and awareness that she recognized from her own training. This human had been taught to fight, and taught well. Later that evening, during the formal dinner that brought all delegations together, Zilara positioned herself close to the human table. She wanted to observe them more closely, to understand what made this species think they belonged among the stars. The dinner conversation was boring, full of trade agreements and diplomatic pleasantries that meant nothing. But then Lord Krethax of the Kethrani noble houses decided to make things interesting. He approached the human table with 3 of his guards behind him, his scales bright red with aggressive intent. Lord Krethax had lost territory to the humans in a recent border dispute settled through galactic arbitration rather than combat. He had never forgiven them for refusing to face him in a proper duel. Ambassador Powell looked up as he approached, her expression calm but wary. Lord Krethax spoke loudly enough for the entire hall to hear, calling humans a species of prey animals who hid behind laws and treaties because they were too weak to fight for what they wanted. He said they were cowards who would be conquered the moment they faced a real warrior species. He said their presence at this summit was an insult to every species that had earned their place through strength. Grew quiet. Every eye turned to watch how the humans would respond to this public humiliation. Ambassador Powell began to rise, her face flushed with anger, but Daniel Carter placed a gentle hand on her arm. He remained seated, his expression unchanged, and simply continued eating his dinner, as if Lord Krethax had said nothing at all. The silence stretched for a long moment. Lord Krethax waited for a response that did not come, his scales darkening with confusion and frustration. Finally, Daniel looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, no anger, nothing but calm patience. He said that the food here was excellent, and asked Lord Krethax if he had tried the appetizers from the third course. Several delegates from other species laughed nervously. Lord Krethax sputtered with rage, unable to process an insult he had never encountered before. Being ignored was worse than any verbal response, worse than any challenge. Away, his guards following, while Daniel returned to his meal as if nothing had happened. Xylara watched all of this with growing interest. Every other species she had encountered would have responded to such an insult with either fear or aggression. The human had shown neither. He had simply refused to play the game, refused to give Lord Krethax the reaction he wanted. That night, Xylara returned to her quarters and summoned her intelligence officer. She wanted to know everything about Daniel Carter, every detail of his life that could be found in human records. The officer returned 3 hours later with a report that was surprisingly thin. Daniel Carter had served in something called the United States Marine Corps for 30 years before retiring to diplomatic work. His service record contained large sections that were classified, hidden behind security clearances that even Kethrani intelligence could not penetrate. What little information was available painted a picture of a man who had been sent to difficult places to do difficult things, and who had always returned when others did not. The words special operations appeared several times, though their exact meaning was unclear. Xylara read the report twice, then set it aside with a smile spreading across her face. Perhaps this diplomatic summit would not be boring after all. Perhaps she had finally found something interesting among these supposedly primitive humans. She began to plan her next move, and her scales shifted to the bright orange of anticipation. The morning sun of Villanthra Prime painted the diplomatic reception hall in shades of amber and gold as representatives gathered for the second day of negotiations. Xylara had spent the night planning exactly how she would approach the humans, turning over every possible outcome in her mind until she was satisfied with her strategy. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her forearms held loosely at her sides, in a pose that communicated peaceful intent to those who understood Kethrani body language. Other delegates stepped aside as she passed, showing the respect and fear that her reputation demanded. She found the human delegation near the refreshment tables, where Ambassador Powell was speaking quietly with her advisors about the morning schedule. Daniel Carter stood slightly apart from the group, holding a cup of something hot and watching the room with those calm eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Xylara approached them directly, scales shifting to a pleasant blue-green that indicated friendly intentions. She greeted Ambassador Powell with the formal words her tutors had taught her, expressing hope that the humans were finding the summit productive. The ambassador responded with equal formality, clearly suspicious of why a Kethrani princess would seek them out. Xylara let the pleasantries continue for a few minutes before revealing her true purpose. She explained that her people had a tradition of cultural exchange through friendly combat, a way of building understanding between species through the universal language of physical skill. She said she had noticed that humans seemed to value strength and courage based on the stories and entertainment they broadcast across their communication networks. She proposed a demonstration match, a friendly exhibition that would allow both species to showcase their martial traditions and build respect between their peoples. Powell's expression tightened, and she began to explain that humans did not share this particular tradition. She spoke carefully about how her species preferred to resolve differences through dialogue and negotiation, rather than physical confrontation. Zylara interrupted her with a gentle laugh, her scales flickering with amusement that she did not try to hide. She pointed out that refusing such an invitation could be seen as an insult by her people, a suggestion that humans considered themselves too good for Kethrani customs. She mentioned that several important trade agreements were currently being negotiated between their governments, agreements that could be affected by any diplomatic incidents at this summit. The threat was subtle but clear, wrapped in politeness but sharp as any blade. Ambassador Powell went pale, understanding exactly what was being proposed. If she refused, the Kethrani might withdraw from trade talks worth billions of credits. If she accepted, one of her people would have to face the greatest warrior the Kethrani Empire had produced in 3 centuries. Daniel Carter stepped forward before the ambassador could respond. He spoke quietly, asking the princess to clarify the terms of this proposed exhibition. Zylara turned to face him directly, surprised that a cultural attaché would insert himself into such a discussion. She explained that the match would follow standard Kethrani dueling rules, first to yield or first blood, with no serious injury intended. She said the combatants could choose any weapons from the traditional dueling hall, where blades from 100 worlds were kept for exactly such occasions. She emphasized that this was purely a friendly demonstration, a chance for both species to learn from each other. Daniel nodded slowly, then turned to Ambassador Powell. He spoke to her in a voice too quiet for Zylara to hear, engaged in a brief but intense whispered conversation. The ambassador's face shifted through several emotions, from shock to concern to reluctant acceptance. Finally, she turned back to Zylara and announced that the human delegation would be honored to accept her gracious invitation. Daniel Carter would represent humanity in the exhibition match. Zylara's scales brightened with delight that she did not bother to conceal. She had expected them to offer a soldier, perhaps one of the security personnel who guarded the delegation. Instead, they were sending this aging diplomat, with his limp and his gray hair and his calm eyes. The match would be over in moments, a quick and painless demonstration of Kethrani superiority that would put these humans in their proper place. She led the group to the dueling hall, sending servants ahead to prepare the arena and invite spectators. Word spread quickly through the summit, and soon delegates from every species were making their way to witness what promised to be an interesting spectacle. The dueling hall was a circular chamber with raised seating surrounding a sand-covered fighting floor. Ancient weapons lined the walls, blades and clubs and more exotic tools of combat collected over centuries of Kethrani expansion. Zylara gestured grandly at the weapon displays, inviting Daniel to choose whatever he wished. It was a gesture of supreme confidence, allowing an opponent to select the terms of their own defeat. Daniel walked slowly along the walls, examining each weapon with the careful attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. He passed by energy swords and neural disruptors and graviton whips without showing interest. He ignored sonic blades and plasma cutters and crystalline weapons that sang with barely contained power. Finally, he stopped before a simple display case containing fighting knives, blades barely longer than his forearm, with leather-wrapped handles and no technological enhancement. He picked up 2 of them, testing their weight and balance with small movements of his wrists. Then he turned to Zillara and said that these would do. Murmurs ran through the crowd of spectators. The human had chosen the most basic weapons in the entire hall, tools that any Kethrani child would consider beneath their dignity. Zillara wondered if he was mocking her, or simply did not understand what he was facing. She selected her own weapons from a place of honor near the center of the hall, 4 crescent blades that had been in her family for 20 generations. Each blade was perfectly balanced for Kethrani hands, curved in a way that allowed for both slashing and blocking movements. Together they formed a defensive and offensive system that no two-armed species could hope to match. She took her position on the fighting floor, her scales now shifting to the deep crimson of battle readiness. Daniel walked to face her, his 2 small knives held loosely in hands that seemed utterly relaxed. The officiator, an ancient Valanthran who had overseen thousands of such matches, raised a ceremonial staff. He recited the rules in a voice that echoed through the chamber, confirming that this was a match to first yield or first blood, that serious injury was not intended, and that both combatants accepted these terms. Both fighters indicated their agreement. The staff came down, and the match began. Zillara attacked immediately, all 4 arms moving in perfect coordination to overwhelm her opponent from multiple angles. She expected the human to retreat, to block desperately, to make some futile attempt to defend himself against attacks coming from directions he could not possibly cover. Instead, Daniel simply was not there. He moved sideways at the exact moment her blades arrived, sliding past her attack with a margin so small it seemed impossible. Her weapons cut through empty air while the human repositioned himself behind her. She spun to face him, her scales flickering with surprise she could not entirely hide. The crowd had gone silent, every spectator leaning forward to see what would happen next. Zillara launched her second attack with more caution than the first, studying her opponent as she moved. She came at him from his left side, using her lower arms to feint, while her upper arms carried the real threat toward his neck and chest. Daniel shifted his weight and turned his body, letting her blades pass within inches of his skin without touching him. He did not strike back. He did not even raise his knives to block. He simply avoided her attack and returned to a neutral stance, watching her with those patient eyes. The princess felt her scales begin to shift toward yellow, a color of frustration that she struggled to suppress. She was faster than this human, stronger than this human, and armed with twice as many weapons. Every calculation said she should have ended this match in the first 3 seconds. Yet somehow, he continued to stand before her, untouched and unworried. She increased her speed, calling upon techniques she didn't even know about, had learned from masters across the empire. Her blades wove patterns in the air that would have been invisible to most species, attacks that came from unexpected angles and combined in ways that left no defensive openings. Daniel moved through them like water flowing around stones in a river. He seemed to know where her blades would be before she did, stepping and turning and ducking with an economy of motion that made her wild attacks look clumsy by comparison. Minutes passed, and the crowd's murmurs grew louder. No one had ever seen a Kethrani princess unable to land a single blow. No one had ever seen a human move like this, with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime studying how bodies worked and how to make them fail. Zillara paused to catch her breath, her forearms burning with exhaustion from attacks that had struck nothing but air. Sweat beaded on her scaled skin, and her crests lay flat against her skull in a display of exertion she could not hide. Daniel stood before her, breathing normally, his knives still held loosely at his sides. He had not even moved enough to wrinkle his shirt. The princess felt something she had not experienced in over a century, the cold touch of doubt creeping into her mind. She had faced opponents who were faster, opponents who were stronger, opponents who had exotic abilities that seemed impossible to counter. She had defeated all of them through skill and determination, and the absolute certainty that she would not lose. But this human was different. He was not trying to beat her. He was not trying to win the match. He was simply refusing to let her succeed, denying her every opportunity to claim victory without offering any threat in return. It was like fighting smoke, like trying to grab water with her bare hands. She attacked again, pushing her body to its limits, using combinations she had practiced 10,000 times until they were burned into her muscles. Her blades sang through the air with deadly precision, each strike flowing into the next in an unbroken chain of violence. Daniel stepped inside her guard. The movement was so smooth and sudden that Zylara did not process it until it was already over. One moment he was retreating from her attack, and the next he was standing beside her, with his shoulder almost touching her chest. He could have killed her in that instant. He could have driven his knife into her throat or her heart or any of a dozen vital points that her aggressive attack had left exposed. Instead, he simply spoke, his voice calm and quiet in the sudden silence of the arena. He asked her if she wanted to know why he was not attacking. He asked her if she understood what she had actually challenged today. Zylara froze. Her blade stopped in mid-motion, her scales shifting through colors too quickly for anyone to read. Opponent had ever spoken to her during a match. No opponent had ever been close enough to speak without getting cut. She stepped back and lowered her weapon slightly, curiosity overriding her fighting instincts. She demanded to know who he really was and what trick he was using to avoid her attacks. He said that humans measured time differently than most species in the galaxy. He explained that their short lives forced them to learn quickly, to compress decades of experience into years, to become skilled in ways that longer-lived species never needed to master. He told her that he had been fighting since before she was born, not in ritual duels or honorable combat, but in the desperate, ugly conflicts that had marked humanity's path to the stars. He said that his species had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other, developing martial traditions that covered every possible situation and weapon and environment. He mentioned names and places that meant nothing to Zylara. Wars fought in jungles and deserts and frozen wastelands. Battles in cities and mountains and places where the only rule was survival. He said he had been trained by masters who had been trained by masters. An unbroken chain of knowledge passed down through generations of warriors who had refined their skills through actual combat rather than ritual. He told her about something called special operations, units of humans selected for their abilities and trained to do things that normal soldiers could not accomplish. He said he had spent 3 decades doing jobs that his government would never acknowledge, in places that officially did not exist, against enemies who had every advantage except the one that mattered. The crowd listened in stunned silence as this aging human described a history of violence that made Kethrani conquest look almost gentle. They heard about humans fighting humans with weapons and tactics that evolved constantly, each generation building on the lessons of those who came before. They learned that while the Kethrani had been conquering systems through single combat, humans had been fighting world wars that killed millions, developing weapons that could destroy cities, and training soldiers who could survive in any environment against any odds. Daniel explained that humanity had not come to the stars looking for conquest. They had come because they were tired of conquering, tired of the endless cycle of violence that had marked their entire history. They wanted trade and friendship and peace, not because they were weak, but because they had learned through bitter experience what strength really cost. His people had a saying, he told her, that those who had seen war were the ones who worked hardest for peace. The arena was completely silent now. Every species stared at the human with new understanding in their eyes. They had all assumed that humanity's preference for diplomacy was a sign of weakness, that their reluctance to fight meant they could not fight. Now they were beginning to realize they had made a terrible mistake. Zilara looked at the human standing before her with his simple knives and his calm eyes. She saw the scars on his forearms that she had noticed before, marks left by weapons and violence that suddenly told a different story. She understood that this exhibition match had never been a contest. It had been a lesson, and she was the student. Zilara stood motionless as Daniel's words settled into her mind like stones dropping into still water. She had lived for 200 years and fought champions from a dozen worlds, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of complete re-evaluation. The human before her was not a diplomat pretending to be a warrior. He was a warrior pretending to be a diplomat, and there was a vast difference between those two things. She asked him why he had not simply defeated her from the beginning, why he had allowed her to exhaust herself with futile attacks when he could have ended the match in seconds. Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. He said that victory without understanding was meaningless, that defeating her body while leaving her pride intact would have accomplished nothing. He explained that his goal was not to humiliate the Kethrani or prove human superiority. His goal was to open a door, to show her and everyone watching that the universe was larger and more complex than they had assumed. He told her that the Kethrani tradition of ritual combat was not wrong, merely incomplete. It worked well against species who shared similar values and fighting styles, but it left them vulnerable to those who played by different rules. Humans had learned this lesson many times throughout their history, encountering enemies who did not fight fair, and adapting their tactics to survive. He said that flexibility was humanity's greatest strength, the ability to learn from every defeat and incorporate new techniques into their own traditions. The arena remained silent as he spoke. Hundreds of delegates processing information that challenged everything they thought they knew about the youngest species in the galactic community. Zilara felt her scales slowly shifting from yellow frustration to blue contemplation. She was beginning to understand that this human had given her something more valuable than victory. He had given her knowledge. She asked him to show her what human combat really looked like, not the restrained defense he had demonstrated, but the full expression of his skills. It was a request that carried weight, an acknowledgement that she wanted to learn rather than simply win. Daniel paused, and something shifted in his expression. The calm patience that had defined his demeanor throughout the match faded, replaced by something harder and more focused. He warned her that what she was asking for could be dangerous, that human combat techniques were designed to end fights quickly and permanently. She confirmed that she understood, raising her four blades into a defensive posture that protected her vital areas while still allowing for counterattacks. Daniel moved. The change was so sudden that even Zylara's trained eyes struggled to follow what happened. One moment he was standing 5 feet away. The next, he was inside her guard again, his knife pressed against the soft scales beneath her chin. She had not seen him cross the distance. She had not seen him slip past her blades. She only knew that he had done both things in the time it took her to blink. But he was not finished. He stepped back and circled to her right, then attacked from an angle she had not expected. His movements were no longer the fluid, water-like evasions he had shown before. Now they were sharp and direct, each motion carrying lethal intent that he pulled back at the last possible instant. His knife touched her wrist, her hip, the back of her knee, each contact point marking a spot where he could have crippled or killed her if he had chosen to complete the strike. The crowd gasped as they watched the human dismantle the greatest warrior of the Kethrani Empire with surgical precision. He was not faster than her, not really, would move before she moved there. He anticipated her defensive shifts and positioned himself to exploit the gaps that opened when she tried to block. It was like watching someone solve a puzzle they had solved 1,000 times before, each piece falling into place with inevitable certainty. Zylara abandoned defense and launched a desperate attack, all 4 arms striking at once in a combination that had defeated every opponent she had ever faced. Daniel dropped beneath her blades and swept her legs out from under her with a movement that used her own momentum against her. She hit the sand hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs, and before she could recover, his knife was at her throat again. This time his eyes held something different. Not the patient calm of a teacher, but the cold assessment of someone who had ended lives and could end another without hesitation. She saw in that moment what human soldiers must have looked like to their enemies throughout history, relentless and efficient and utterly without mercy. Then the coldness faded, and Daniel offered her his hand. She took it, allowing him to help her to her feet, her scales now cycling through colors that had no easy translation. The arena erupted in noise as delegates processed what they had witnessed. Some shouted in alarm, others in admiration, and a few sat in stunned silence, unable to articulate what they were feeling. Ambassador Powell was on her feet, her face pale, clearly uncertain whether Daniel's display had helped or harmed human diplomatic interests. The Kethrani delegation was in chaos, their warrior princess defeated by a human who had not even tried until the end. Lord Krethax, who had insulted the humans the night before, looked like he was going to be sick. Zylara ignored all of them, her attention focused entirely on the human who had just taught her the most important lesson of her life. Asked him one question, speaking quietly, so that only he could hear. She asked him if this was why humans sought peace, because they knew what they were capable of in war. Daniel met her eyes and answered honestly. He said that humans sought peace because they had seen what happened when they did not, had seen their own cities burn, and their own people suffer, and their own children grow up in the shadow of violence. He said that every veteran carried memories they wished they did not have, images of things done and things witnessed that never truly faded. He told her that peace was not the absence of strength but the choice not to use it, and that choice was harder than any battle. His species was trying to become something better than their history, to prove that the violence that had shaped them did not have to define their future. The stars offered a chance to start fresh, to build relationships based on trade and cooperation, rather than conquest and domination. Zylara listened to his words and felt something shift inside her, a door opening to possibilities she had never considered. She had spent her entire life believing that strength was the only thing that mattered, that those who could not fight deserved to be conquered. Now she was beginning to understand that true strength might lie in knowing when not to fight at all. The arena slowly quieted as Zylara stepped away from Daniel and turned to face the assembled delegates. Her scales had settled into a deep blue that indicated serious contemplation, a color that many of the younger Kethrani had never seen their princess display. She raised all 4 arms in a gesture that silenced the remaining murmurs and commanded the attention of every being in the chamber. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly to every corner of the arena, amplified by the acoustic design that had served Kethrani ritual combat for thousands of years. She announced that the demonstration was over, and that she had learned what she needed to learn. She declared that humanity had passed the trial of champions, not through victory in combat, but through something far more impressive. They had demonstrated mastery without cruelty, strength without arrogance, and wisdom without weakness. The Kethrani valued warriors above all else. Warriors knew when to fight and when to teach. Daniel Carter had proven himself a true warrior, and through him, humanity had earned the respect of the Kethrani Empire. The delegates erupted in confused discussion as they tried to understand what was happening. Princess Zylara had never praised the defeated opponent, had never acknowledged that any species might have something to teach the Kethrani. Her words represented a fundamental shift in how her empire would approach relations with humanity going forward. Lord Krethax pushed through the crowd, his scales bright red with anger and embarrassment. He demanded to know how the princess could offer such praise to a species that had refused to face Kethrani warriors in proper combat for years. He accused the human of using tricks and deception rather than honest martial skill. Zylara turned to face him with an expression that made the noble take an involuntary step backward. He understood nothing. That he had spent too long fighting opponents who played by his rules to recognize real danger when it stood before him. She reminded him that Daniel had not used tricks or deception. He had simply chosen not to kill her, and that choice had been his to make from the very first moment of their match. Lord Krethax opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it when he saw the look in his princess's eyes. He retreated into the crowd, his scales fading to a muted gray that indicated submission. Zylara returned her attention to the human delegation, specifically to Ambassador Powell, who still looked uncertain about everything that had occurred. The princess made a formal declaration that the Kethrani Empire would seek full alliance with Earth, not as conquerors to subjects, but as warriors to warriors. She said that her people had much to learn from a species that had traveled so far in such a short time. Humans might also find value in what the Kethrani had to offer. Ambassador Powell stepped forward, her composure restored, and accepted the offer with diplomatic grace. She spoke about the benefits of cooperation between their species, about trade routes and cultural exchange, and the possibility of joint exploration of unknown regions of space. But Zylara was not finished. She approached Daniel directly, removing one of her crescent blades from its sheath. The delegates gasped, uncertain what the princess intended. But instead of raising the weapon in threat, she turned it in her hands and offered it to Daniel, hilt first. She explained that this blade had been carried by the rulers of her house for 20 generations, used in over 100 duels that had shaped the destiny of her empire. She said it was tradition to offer such a weapon to an opponent who had taught you something valuable. And today, Daniel had taught her more than any opponent she had ever faced. He had shown her that victory was not the only measure of strength, that sometimes the greatest warriors were those who chose peace when they could have chosen violence. Daniel accepted the blade with a small bow, handling it with the respect it deserved. He said that he was honored by her gift and hoped that it would symbolize a new era between their peoples. Then he smiled and asked if she had eaten lunch yet, because all that exercise had made him hungry, and he knew a restaurant on the station that served something called pasta that he thought she might enjoy. The tension in the room broke as delegates began to laugh and talk among themselves. The formal moment had passed, replaced by something more human, more personal, more real. Zylara found herself laughing too, a sound that surprised her guards and advisors, who had rarely heard such a thing from their serious princess. She accepted his invitation, and together they walked out of the arena side by side. Behind them, the galactic community was already beginning to reshape itself around the events they had witnessed. Word would spread to every corner of known space about the human who had faced the greatest Kethrani warrior and won without striking a blow. Species that had dismissed humanity as young and weak would begin to reconsider their assumptions. Trade negotiations would proceed with new respect for the human position. Military strategists would review their assessments and wonder what else they had missed about this supposedly primitive species. In the restaurant, over plates of food from a dozen worlds, Zylara asked Daniel one final question. She wanted to know what his people called warriors like him, those who had seen the worst of combat and emerged with the wisdom to seek peace. Daniel considered the question while eating, his eyes distant with memories he did not share. Finally, he answered, with a word that did not translate well into Galactic Standard. His people called them veterans. The word carried weight that its simple sound did not suggest, encompassing experiences and sacrifices that could not be easily explained to those who had not lived them. Veterans were those who had served, who had fought, who had done what their society asked of them, and survived to carry the burden of that service for the rest of their lives. They were not celebrated as heroes or worshipped as warriors. They were simply people who had done difficult things, and now sought to build something better from the ashes of what they had experienced. Zylara asked how many veterans humanity had among its population. Daniel smiled and told her that there were more of them than the stars could count. Every generation produced new ones, men and women who answered the call when their people needed them, and then returned home to live quiet lives among their families and communities. They did not seek glory or conquest. They sought only to ensure that the sacrifices they had made meant something, that the future would be better than the past. The princess sat in silence for a long time after that, her food forgotten as she contemplated the implications of what she had learned. She had challenged a human for fun, expecting an easy victory that would demonstrate Kathrani's superiority. Instead, she had faced a true legend, one of countless millions who walked among the stars, carrying the weight of humanity's bloody history on their shoulders. And in losing that challenge, she had won something far more valuable than any trophy. She had gained a friend, an ally, and a glimpse of what the galaxy might become when species stopped fighting long enough to learn from each other. Outside the restaurant windows, the stars sparkled with possibilities that neither of them could fully imagine. Explore those possibilities together, and that was enough for now.